So this is starting Unit 3, which is the Revolutionary Period. And so we're looking to see how the 13 colonies unite and then start the Revolutionary War against Great Britain and form the United States. So just as a warm-up question to get you thinking as we get started, think about what makes people unite. So we talked about in Unit 2 that there were 13 British colonies, and each colony was founded for different reasons. There were different groups of people who lived in those colonies, and they had different systems of trade and politics and things like that. And even though there were 3 regions, the regions themselves were also very different. And so many of you asked when we were talking about mercantilism why the colonies didn't unite, and it was because they were all so different. So what makes different people unite? And the answer to that is typically a common enemy. And today we're going to learn how Britain started to be considered an enemy of the colonies by talking about the French and Indian War. So the French and Indian War is also known as the 7 Years' War. It was called the 7 Years' War in Europe, and it was actually a war that had started in Europe and then kind of spilled over to the colonies. And the French and Indian War lasted from 1754 to 1763. So even though it's called the 7 Years' War, it technically lasted for 9 years. Obviously, historians aren't good at math, but the real reason for that is because the war is really kind of over by 1761, but the actual peace treaty didn't get signed until 1763. And the French and Indian War is not against the French and Indians, but it is a war from Britain versus the French and the Indians. So most Native Americans allied with the French. If you remember from Unit 2 and from Unit 1, the French had the best relationship with the Native Americans, and so the war is fought between the British and the French and their Native American allies. For the first 2 years of the French and Indian War, the French and Indians were very successful. It actually looked like Britain was going to lose, and then we'll talk about how that changes. So let's talk about what causes the war to begin with. There are several different causes of the French and Indian War. And one of those causes is the long-standing rivalry between France and England. So for centuries, France and England hated each other. And in fact, France and England will be enemies all the way up until World War I when they become allies. And so France and England were already fighting a war in Europe because of their long-standing rivalry with each other. And this kind of bleeds over into the New World as they were competing with each other for land in North America. Specifically, they were fighting for control over the Ohio River Valley. So the Ohio River is a large river in North America, and along the Ohio River Valley, there was really fertile land that the British wanted for farming. So the British wanted to extend their original 13 colonies further west into the Ohio River Valley because they want that land for farming. But that land was also really good for hunting, specifically beaver. Remember, France made a lot of money off of the beaver fur trade, and so beavers obviously live near water and rivers, and so they want that land for hunting and trading. And so all of these are causes that lead up to the conflict of the French and Indian War. So the Ohio River Valley is this area of territory right here. So here were the 13 British colonies. This was the territory that France controlled in the New World, and they are fighting over this area right here. The Ohio River Valley was west of the Appalachian Mountains, and it was rich in resources. The British viewed it as theirs. Obviously, the French thought it was theirs, and so they both are going to start creating forts to protest against the other side, and the creation of forts was seen as an act of aggression, which will eventually lead to the declaration of war. So the French and Indian War is fought. You can see the red are British victories, and then the blue are French victories. We're not going to talk too much about the military aspects of the war. If you're interested in learning more about that, you could watch the movie The Last of the Mohicans. It's about the French and Indian War. But I told you for the first 2 years, the French and the Indians were pretty successful, but then the tide starts to change for a couple reasons. In 1757, William Pitt became the Prime Minister of England, and when he becomes the new Prime Minister, he begins to pour a ton of money into the war effort. So whereas before England was losing pretty badly, now that they have more money and more resources, the British start to be the ones that are winning the French and Indian War. The other reason that the British start to win is that in 1759, the colonists actually helped fight with the British Army to capture French outposts. Outposts, think of them kind of as like smaller forts. They're not as big as a regular fort, but they're still a military base. And so the colonists were helping the British, and the colonists have a stake in this war because they also wanted more land that they can move further west on and farm on and make money off of. But there's one colonist specifically who is helping, and that was George Washington. George Washington becomes one of the leading British generals during the war. So even though Washington, he was from Virginia, he was a colonist. Remember that the colonists thought of themselves as British, so he's helping fight, and he's helping the British win the French and Indian War. He was a great military general, and this gave him a ton of experience that he'll use to fight against the British in the Revolutionary War in a couple of years after this. And then in 1760, Montreal, which is in Canada, and it was the last outpost in New France surrenders, and this is going to really kind of bring it into the war as France is going to surrender to Britain. And so whenever the war is over, they have to sign a peace treaty, which they do in Paris in 1763, and the peace treaty does a couple of things. Number one, because France lost the war, they're going to lose all of the territory that they owned in Canada, and that territory is going to become part of the British colonies. Because Spain had joined the war towards the end to help the French, they are also one of the losers in the war, and so Spain is going to lose Florida, and it's going to become part of the British colonies. And so basically this means that the entire continent east of the Mississippi River is now controlled by the British. So if we look at this on a map, this was originally the 13 British colonies, and this is the territory that the British are now going to get from the French because they won this war. So all of Canada here, and then this area right here where the Ohio River Valley runs. And then they're also going to get Florida from Spain because Florida had allied with France during the war, which meant that they were going to lose. So if we look at the pre-war boundaries again, you can see this is the area of land that they were fighting over. These were the colonies originally. And then if we look at after, all of this territory that is east of the Mississippi River is now part of Britain. Okay. So let's talk about effects of the war because these are most important for our purposes. There are four major effects of the war. Number one was the Peace of Paris that we just talked about, where France is going to lose its North American empire. So basically, the entire continent of North America is now controlled by British territory and Spanish territory. The second effect of the war is that taxes were placed on the colonists, and this was to help Britain pay for the war. So the British argued that they were fighting this war to protect the colonists. So if they're fighting for the colonists' protection, it meant that the colonists needed to pay for the war because the war was fought to protect them and to help them gain more territory. Well, the colonists weren't very happy about this. They didn't really see it that way. In fact, the colonists were actually paying less taxes than British citizens who lived in England, but they're not very happy because they see that the taxes are a way for England to control them. And so this is going to cause some problems in the colonies and help unite them against the British. One other effect of the war was that in 1763, Pontiac's Rebellion takes place. And Pontiac's Rebellion was a Native American uprising. So after Britain won the war and they gained all of this new land from France, colonists started to move west into the new territory because they want to settle it and they want to use it for farmland. The problem was that there were Native Americans who lived on this land. Remember that the French had great relationships with the Native Americans, so they never tried to take their land like the British are going to do. Well, as the British are moving farther and farther into Native American land, the Native Americans get really upset about it. So there's a Native American leader whose name was Pontiac, think about like the car Pontiac, And he leads this huge uprising against British colonists, and he kills several of the British colonists. Well, in response to this, Britain issues the Proclamation Line of 1763, and this is a very important line. The Proclamation Line is going to prohibit colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. So Britain basically tells the colonists, you can't move west because if you do, you're going to be killed by Native Americans. So the main point of the Proclamation Line was to stop the problems with the Native Americans, but it made the colonists mad. So think about it like this. The colonists are teenagers and Britain is their parent, and the parent is telling them, hey, you can't do this, and the colonists are like, well, I don't like that, I want to do it anyways, and the parents are like, well, you can't do this, it's for your own good that you can't do this, but the colonists are all like, no, I want to do this, I don't care what you say, you don't know what you're talking about. And so even though the Proclamation Line was put in place to actually protect the colonists from Native American attacks, the colonists get mad because they can't do what they want to do. So if you look at the Proclamation Line, it obviously wasn't a real line, but it kind of ran the border of the Appalachian Mountains. And so it's inspired by Pontiac's Rebellion. Like I said, it's going to prohibit settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, and that land was to be reserved for the Indians. It's important to remember, though, this line was not meant to protect the Indians. It was actually meant to end the disputes between the colonists and the natives and to protect the colonists. However, this enrages the settlers because they wanted to settle this new land, and they're just going to ignore it. They're going to be like, the British don't know what they're talking about. They don't have my best interest at heart, so I'm just going to do what I want, and I'm just going to go and settle the land anyways. And so the Proclamation Line, again, was seen by the colonists with the taxation as a way that Britain was trying to control them. So if we end with this question, how did the French and Indian War affect the 13 British colonies? Well, because of things like taxes and the Proclamation Line that occur after the war, it's going to help unite the colonies and their resistance against the British. All right, so hopefully that made sense. What you're going to do, just to show that you understand the main causes and effects of the French and Indian War, is you're going to fill out this cause and effect chart. So you're going to list the things that caused the war. You can just click and type in the box, and then you're going to list the major effects of the war and what those were.